All right, so it's been suggested to me that perhaps those of you who join this class later than our first few sessions would benefit from having the sessions we did in person put online. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that they were not recorded. So I'm going to redo those lectures, and they were each an hour long, and that time constraint kind of forced me to speed up a bit when we were doing this in person. So this will give me a little bit more leeway to be a little bit more fulsome in my commentary on these things. So what I want to do is I want to, and this idea to re-record these things comes from where all good ideas come from, which is my mom. And so we're going to take her advice, and I'm going to put these out as sort of like a bonus episodes or bonus sessions for you to take advantage of over Christmas. And for those of you who haven't heard the opening of my class previously, or the introduction to the subject material that we covered, which was the Roman Empire and Roman Judea, this will be an attempt or an opportunity for you to catch up, I suppose. So our first session, we looked at the Roman Empire. And for those of you who were already in my class at the time, this will be review for you. Maybe there'll be some new information, some stuff that we hadn't covered before. So I started off by introducing why I wanted to do a class on this subject and why I think that it's important. And so that's where we're going to start today. The church is basically a body made up of many members working together towards a common goal and having the same hope. The history of the church informs us of where we've been and what pitfalls we are prone to, where we've fallen, and what kind of challenges we're able to overcome. The study of the church I want to put out there, I want to posit, is a Trinitarian exercise. I think it's very Trinitarian. Because number one, it speaks to God's faithfulness to his people through the centuries, even though we lack continued revelation. God is faithful in keeping his covenants to his people, and his purposes are not thwarted by time or by man. It speaks to Jesus' headship of the church. The church has never failed or disappeared since his ascension. In fact, it has expanded and it has contracted, you could say, but it has never, ever disappeared, and we are promised that it never will. And it speaks to the success of the work of the Holy Spirit by spreading the gospel, convicting mankind, expanding the church by preaching the gospel. It's a Trinitarian exercise, and it's an exercise that has a great deal of value to us as Christians. It connects us to each other as we realize that we all have a common heritage as Christians. The Christian family that we are a part of will last eternally. Your family here, your familiar family, your marriage family, the intimacy that you have between husband and wife, the connections that you have between siblings or between fathers and children, that's going to fall away. But we know that the connection between us and Christ and amongst each other as brothers and sisters will not fall away. It's eternal. It's going to keep happening. The people sitting around you, the Christians that you know, the people in your church, so long as they are true believers in Christ, they're going to be with you in heaven at the end of days. And that's how intimately connected we are to each other and to Christ. This is not a temporal thing. This is permanent. This is eternal. This is real. And the importance of our story is actually that's really interesting. There's lots of interesting stuff that goes on. You could almost say that the history of the church is the history of Western civilization. In fact, many times the history of Western civilization, the history of the church, are so melded together that it's difficult to pull them apart. The political history and the church history, the political history of Western and Eastern Europe, for example, and the church meld together very well. And they only really start diverging in the Age of Reason, when you have philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau and Marx and guys like that who are open about their atheism and about seeing that as a societal good, that uh, theism or belief in God is kind of outmoded. So knowing where we've come from is really important. You know your family history. In fact, what do? When you go to the doctor and you have a problem, the doctor says, well, do you have a family history of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, eye problems, all sorts of things? Because it helps them know where to start looking. Is this the onset of some inherited genetic thing? Is it something that we need to be aware of going forward as you age? What are things that we need to be aware of? Really easy things that we can pick out now and maybe mitigate. That's the point of taking a medical history and knowing your family history. Knowing your family history is important. Who are your parents? Where are they from? Where did they get married? Who are your grandparents? Where are they from? What is their story? Our great grandparents as Mennonites, and our great great grandparents, and our great 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 grandparents, they came over here from Imperial Russia. Well, where were they before then? They were in before they were in Imperial Russia. They were in the part of what is now Poland, the northern part of Poland called the Vistula Delta, which used to be part of Germany. And before that, they were in northern Holland. And just one thing that comes out of that is that the Low German language is a derivative of the Northern Dutch language, which I believe is called Frisian. And the language moves with the Mennonites throughout Northern Europe. And Frisian was actually a very common language amongst the Hanseatic League, which was a league of Northern German states that traded with each other. So it was actually an important language in the history of Europe, in the history of trade, in the early modern time and late medieval time. And it followed its way here. And in fact, with Low German speakers, when they hear Dutch, they might be able to actually understand a bit of what's being said because the languages have similar roots. History is important. And what we have in the church nowadays, I think, and one of the things that I really want to try and combat with this class is a sort of anti-intellectualism. And what I mean by that is not that people oppose people who are smart or that people value being stupid. What I mean is that people are starting to value their experiences and their emotions more than they value knowledge. And I think that this comes true when you hear phrases like, well, what does this verse mean to me? The old way of thinking is that verses don't mean different things to different people. They might have a different significance to you at different points in your life, but their meaning does not change. The fact that Jesus walked the road to Emmaus does not change based on your experiences or your emotion. It's kind of set in stone. The same thing with other verses. And when we start taking an anti-intellectual viewpoint, when we start hiving off theology from our faith practices, from our worship, we start to get a whole bunch of errors coming in. And I've discussed this in previous sessions. And so I think it's important that we understand our history. We understand the value of Christianity to Western society. Christianity is the basis of Western society. It is so monolithic in the history of the West. It is so pervasive, so influential. Christian values are so important. You cannot separate Western history from a history of the church. And to properly understand Western history and Western thought, you need to understand the history of the church. You need to understand our story. This also connects us with Christians past and present. We think about guys like Martin Luther and John Calvin, the Apostle Paul, and Peter, and all these guys who come before us as kind of historical figures. They're way back there. They're come and gone. Their names on a page, but it's important to remember these are living, breathing human beings, and they're not dead. Well, they're dead in the physical sense, but we have been promised a resurrection. And when we are all resurrected together and we're together again, we're all going to be in the same place. You're going to see Paul, you're going to see Peter, you're going to see Luther, and you're going to see Calvin, and you're going to see all these great Christians from the past. You are connected to them. They are your family, but they are your family in Christ. It is Christ who is the linchpin. And I think it's important that we value them. And when they are denigrated, when the works of past Christians are denigrated, that's a denigration of us in a way. It's something we should not feel comfortable about. These are your family members. If somebody insulted your mother or your grandmother, or great-grandmother, great-grandfather, something like that, you might feel a twinge of, hey, back off. Do we feel that way about the Christians of the past? When the church is criticized for past actions, are we looking at that and saying, yeah, of course, that was bad? Or are we thinking critically and saying, well, what's the basis of it? What do we understand this event to be? What was the value system that was being transpired? Were there actually Christian principles being thought about here? And it changes how we view history. We cannot view history through we should not be viewing history primarily through a secular liberal lens. That's the modern way of viewing history. Through a liberal socio-political way, it's Marxist interpretations of history, the social classes, that sort of thing. But we must be cognizant that the church plays a massive role. And if it's not necessary to criticize the church, why would we? Right? So it's important that we understand events as they happened. We understand what happened. And we understand who these people are, because they're like us. When they made mistakes, they made mistakes. When they had successes, they had successes, just like us. So the study of history is super important. It's our family history. It's who we are. It's all the things. It's knowing your family. It's knowing where you come from. Because when you join the church, you start to come from a different place. Your family changes. And your temporal family, and it's important to remember that your temporal family might be good, but it also might be really bad. Lots of people come from bad family situations. They don't have, they don't know their mom or their dad. They had bad relationships with them. But when you join the church, you're joining a family that's eternal, and you gain not imperfect parents, but a father who is perfect. And you gain a peace and an understanding and an assurance that is beyond anything that can be guaranteed by an earthly family. This is a great family. It's important to understand all this stuff, and that's why we're going to study it. And it's also, like I said, really interesting. So when I started this class, the first topic I dealt with was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is important to understand because it was so monolithic, and I'm going to use that term several times probably. It was so monolithic. Think of a monolith. I don't know if any of you have ever seen something that is so big, it dominates the space that it's in. You cannot get away from it. Its size, its shape, its height, everything about it just dominates the space. It is monolithic. And the Roman Empire is monolithic in Western history. So much of government, of politics, of the development of Western Europe and Canada and the United States, and laws and rights and our understanding of citizenship and freedom and government come from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is the foundation of modern engineering, running hot and cold running water, aqueducts, public sanitation, health, roads, all sorts of things start in the Roman Empire. This is the thing that gives us the base. These are the people who inspire in the Renaissance. It's the Roman Empire and the ancient Greeks who inspire the great writers and the engineers to look at it and say, how can we improve things? And they find a lot of good stuff in the Roman Empire. So it's important for us to look at the Roman Empire, to understand it, to get kind of an idea of what it was and what it wasn't. And as I said during our class on Roman persecution, we as Christians tend to view the Roman Empire as the great boogeyman of the early church. And we view it as sort of an empire that once Christ came and he was delivering his message, they were on the Christians like, I was trying to think of a clever Southern phrase there, but I'm not Southern. So they were on them like a magnet sticks to a fridge. That's a Manitoba statement. And they never let up. And as we learned in the session on persecution, that wasn't true. But the Roman Empire had a lot of benefits for Christians, and we're going to take a look at that as well. So start off, and I'll show you, this is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. In 117 AD, this is under the reign of the Emperor Trajan, and you can see just the sheer vast area that it covers. It goes from the Scottish-English border down through France and Spain and Portugal and Italy into modern Austria, Slovenia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, the old Yugoslavia, now Montenegro and Greece and Italy, and into North Africa with Egypt, Tunisia. And I'm not going to try and name all these countries to show off to you. No, I won't try that because I know I'll just embarrass myself. But look at all the countries. There's tons of countries that it covers. Something in the order of like 50 some. It's quite impressive. And you can see that even at its furthest extent, it had control all the way up to the Persian Gulf. That is modern Iran. We tend to think as sort of like the Judean area as kind of like the borderlands, but at the extent of the Roman Empire, it extended quite a ways into the Middle East. It is really something to behold. And you can see up there, it goes as far north as Dacia. Now, the northern border of Rome always sort of was along the Danube and along the Rhine rivers, and it never really went north from there. The Germanic tribes which lived there were very aggressive, so to speak. They did a really good job of keeping the Romans out of their area. And later on, these Germanic tribes would spell the death of the Western Roman Empire. But in any case, you can see that they basically created a lake, a Roman lake, out of the Mediterranean Sea. So the most important parts of the Roman Empire perpetually was Egypt, Italy. Egypt and Italy were very important, as was Asia Minor. Egypt was very important because of its grain. Egypt is a huge grain producing area. The Nile Delta is one of the most fertile regions in the world, and in the ancient world even more so because of the annual floods of the Nile. The Nile would flood every spring, and that would reintroduce a great wealth of nutrients into the soil. And so there's a great deal of grain, and Egypt supplied grain basically to Rome, to the Roman Empire, and the grain trade between the city of Rome and Egypt was an issue of national importance. This was a state level issue. This wasn't just a business thing. This was the survival of the state, the stability of Rome depends on the regular supply of grain from Egypt. So very important there. So anyway, that is the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. In 117 AD. The empire is so large it covers 50 modern-day countries. At its height, its population is over 50 million people. Rome, as an ancient city, reaches a population of 1 million people. If you've ever been to Pompeii or to any Roman ruins, but Pompeii is probably the best one in terms of intact Roman cities. Herculaneum is another good one. You get an idea of what a Roman city was like, what the streets were like, what the sanitation was like. And 1 million people in a city of narrow streets, that's got to get bad. That's got to get really uncomfortable. And it did. And a lot of rich Romans had villas in the countryside, as many wealthy Italians do today, to escape the heat and the congestion of Rome. Um, the Roman Empire lasts in direct succession from the mid 20s BC to 1453 AD. That is the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire to the Ottoman Turks. Now, you can also argue that it lasts much longer. You could argue that it lasts until 1806 in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. And the reason is this. In the early medieval period, after the last Western emperor, a guy named Romulus Augustulus, had been dethroned by a Visigothic warlord named Odoacer, the idea of the Roman Empire doesn't die because the Eastern Empire is still intact. It's 476. The Eastern Empire continues for another 1,000 years to 1453. So what a lot of people think is that it's kind of like a legal fiction. The empire, it doesn't exist, but in a legal fiction it does. The empire is still there, the throne is just empty. And I believe it's in 800 on Christmas Day, in the year 800, I think it was the Frankish king, a guy named Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Charlemagne. You may have heard of him. He was a great conqueror, and he had conquered a huge amount of territory in Western Europe, and he had taken on himself the position of protector of the church. And so the Pope offered him the crown of the Western Roman Empire. And so the Charlemagne he's very reluctant to take it at first because he doesn't want the Pope to be able to claim that popes make emperors. And this was a big debate in the medieval church. Who's more powerful, the Pope or the Emperor? But eventually he's convinced to take the crown. He is crowned, and they actually send a message to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor, to agree to recognize him as the Holy Roman Emperor, which the Eastern Emperor does. And this kind of continues until the Eastern Empire falls. And so Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Empire continues on in this legal fiction. There is an emperor in the West that continues until 1806. And the Holy Roman Empire, it fluctuates. Maybe this is a topic for our medieval times to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it's a whole topic in and of itself. But basically, it fluctuates. So under strong emperors, it's very strong and it's big. Under weak emperors, it's small and it's almost just a title in name only. There's no real ability to it. In its stable form in the Middle Ages and into the early modern era, it's a confederation of Germanic states that all the princes of those states owe some sort of allegiance to the person who claims the title of Holy Roman Emperor. But they are basically independent states, but they have an allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, and they have a responsibility, and there's like an imperial parliament which sets policy for the empire. It's a confederation. If you think Canada's confederation is complicated, this is on another scale. So I'm gonna leave that for later on. But in any case, you can say that the Roman Empire continued until 1806 if you want to include the Holy Roman Empire as part of the Roman Empire. That's a pretty big legacy. Rome is noted for its art, for its architectural and engineering brilliance, the stability of its legal and social systems, and the foundation of much of Western thought. Rome is in the ancient West and the Middle East a monolithic civilization, outdoing the Greeks and the Egyptians for influence in the Western world. We really don't think about Egyptian influence. It's kind of gone. The Egyptians were subsumed by the Romans and then later subsumed by the Islamic conquest. And the Greeks were subsumed into the Roman Empire. And in fact, you could say that Greek thought and Greek philosophy and Greek art influenced Rome, and to the point where Rome adopted it as their own culture. And that has, in fact, influenced us today. But the Greek influence goes through Rome. So it's the Roman Empire is huge. It's monolithic. It's important to us. in the West because of the foundations that it gave us for our own art, architecture, even our own languages. So Roman society can be divided into roughly 5 tiers. There are patricians, which are the old aristocratic senatorial families. These are the guys who kind of their whole life was public service. They were independently wealthy. They had, familial wealth, landed gentry, nobles, that sort of thing. Then you had equestrians, who are sort of your upper middle class businessmen and landowners. They often held elected public office. They were a step below the patricians, and in the arena, the patricians would sit in the bottom ring, the ring closest to the action, with marble seats, and then the equestrians would sit one ring up. And the equestrians get their name because these are the they were horse soldiers. So these are the class of people who served as cavalry in the Roman army, because to have a horse, to maintain it, to feed it, is very expensive. Even today, it's very expensive, but that back then even more so. And so these are the people who can afford that. And then you have your plebeians, who are your everyday citizens, like you and me. You have your freemen, who are non-citizens, but who are not slaves either. So these would be people like Peter, for example. Peter would have been a freeman, but he would not have been a plebeian. And then you have slaves. And slaves are roughly 30 to 40% of the population, particularly at the height of the empire. 30 to 40% of the population of Italy are slaves. These are people who are owned as property by others. And Roman slaves weren't necessarily poorly treated. It wasn't just the same type of slavery necessarily as chattel slavery that we all think of when we think of, for example, the American South. The American South is famous for its chattel slavery. That is, and they're famous for the fact that most of their slaves never rose much above, a household servant could probably be the highest you could go. But in Rome, it was a little bit different. Slavery could be very harsh, but they weren't necessarily poorly treated. And in fact, many were doctors, writers, lawyers, financial managers, and other professionals. So if you think about your doctor, imagine owning your doctor. That's something that's kind of anathema to us today, because doctors are kind of seen as in the upper crust of society, but very much so in the Roman Empire, slaves could be doctors, and they could be very good doctors too. Many slaves are captives who are taken on military campaign, but people could also sell themselves into slavery as a form of paying debt. So you would sell yourself into slavery perhaps for a lifetime, but you could also say, I'm going to sell myself to you for a period of 10 years. And at the end of that, I'm freed. And so that sort of thing happened. Wasn't as common, but to be a slave for a citizen would not sell himself into slavery, because that would be to give up your citizenship, essentially. Slavery was also a way of sentencing wrongdoers. You could enslave them. And slaves could be owned by anybody except for other slaves. Slaves could also buy their freedom. They could earn money and buy their freedom. They were not prevented from that. And the Romans had a particular fear of slave revolts. If you all remember the story of Spartacus, which is the story of a guy who's a slave who leads a great slave revolt, that actually happened. It's a historical truth. The movie is a little bit over the top, but it actually happened. And when Rome crushed the Spartacus revolt, it did so in a very brutal way. It, in fact, crucified thousands of these guys along the Appian Way. So as you approached Rome, you'd be walking by the dead and the dying bodies of men crucified on all along the highway into Rome, the main street into Rome. So anyway, slavery is a big institution in the Roman Empire, very important for their economic health and their economic success. Citizenship is highly valued. It qualified you to run for office. It entitled you to a trial and a right of appeal. It gave you the right to own property and make contracts. It gave you the right to travel throughout the empire. It gave you the freedom to not be tortured and to not be whipped, and the right to voluntary exile. And it also entitled you to death by decapitation rather than crucifixion if you were sentenced to death for some reason. Um, Citizenship generally required you to serve in the Roman military, although this was kind of poorly enforced at times and as time went on. As Rome, particularly as the Roman army got more professional, this kind of lapsed into abeyance. So if you look at those values on that list, you'll see that you can probably identify a particular person in the Bible who made good use of those citizenship items, and that is, of course, the Apostle Paul. Paul used his citizenship to travel long ways throughout the empire. He traveled to, throughout the Middle East. He traveled into Asia Minor. He traveled, if you believe the traditions, and even into Spain, some say, and into Rome itself. He used it to prevent himself from being whipped by the Roman guards in Jerusalem during the riot. He used it to demand a trial. He used it to appeal to Caesar. And he he was martyred, if you remember, by decapitation, not crucifixion, unlike Peter, who was crucified. Peter was not a citizen. He did not have the same rights that Paul did. So, citizenship, highly valued, very important to the Romans. And a grant of Roman citizenship was a big deal. To be born a citizen is a big deal. It puts you just, a cut above your average, Greek. If you're a Greek and you're not a citizen versus a Greek who is a citizen, even though you're both Greeks, you're both freemen, it gives you a notch up. Allows you to serve even in public office, to rise through the ranks of the civil service. It's a very important thing. Family, also very important for Rome. The families, particularly families who are citizens, are led by a paterfamilias. So the paterfamilias is the head of the family, and he has authority over everyone in it. He controls the property owned by the family. He controls all the money. He controls the women, the children, and even the grandchildren. So, think about your families. Think about, if you're a dad and you've got your sons and your daughters, and if they're married and they have, spouses and they have children, you would have authority over them, and you would have authority over their properties. And this was a thing that was more so in upper crust families, but you had significant amounts of control over your family. And the paterfamilias even had the authority to kill a member of his family with impunity. And this was often done in a case where um, um, a family member had perhaps disgraced the family in some way, married the wrong person, maybe they've committed a crime or a dishonorable act, or they're an ne'er do well, or whatever it is, they've disgraced themselves in some way. The paterfamilias could exercise his right to knock them off. And there is nothing anybody could do about it. It was his right to do it. He would not be tried for it. That's quite a bit of power. Women are not considered equal to men in Rome, but they do have the ability to own property in their own right, so that's in their own name. They have the right to inherit, and they have the right to initiate a divorce, even though they only receive very basic educations. And this is one of the injustices done to women throughout history, I think. I don't think it's particularly feminist to say that women have, on the whole, been mistreated throughout history. I think that that's fairly clear. And not educating women because their place in the home is just dumb. Like, how many educated women do you know who are not only, great mothers, and they, run companies, or they have big jobs, but they also run families? I mean, the capacity of women is largely underestimated in history, and their influence, even though they have been poorly treated and poorly educated throughout history, is pretty big. But nonetheless, I think that there's a legitimate case that you can make that women have been mistreated throughout history, and giving them very basic educations is one of them. Any case, I digress. Children are considered property of the father, and unwanted babies can be exposed without penalty. Now, if you're familiar with church history, you will know that exposed babies was one of the ministries of the early church. If you had a baby, for example, and the baby came out, or was born, and the father looked at it and said, no, this child has an obvious deformity, or it's clearly defective in some way, or it's the wrong gender. Perhaps you wanted a boy and you had a girl. You had the right to go ahead and expose it. And that essentially meant you take the baby, you take it outside the city, you put it down beside the road, and you leave it to die. And this was very common in Rome. Rome is also known for its illegal abortion industry that happened in the ancient world. The Christians became known around the Roman Empire for adopting infants exposed on the side of the road. They would take them in and nurse them and bring them up as their own children, even infants who had obvious disabilities. And this was one of the great ministries of the church. The church values life because life is a gift from God. Death is a consequence of sin. It is a punishment from God. But life is a gift from God. We must value it, and the early church valued it intensely. And I think we value it intensely too. And so they would take care of these babies, and that was one of the great missions of the early church that gave them great renown and respect throughout the empire. So the family dominated by male heads of family, and yes, that's kind of how it goes there. Patronage. The Roman society had a system called patronage. So basically, a patron is a benefactor who supports and protects their clients. So you have the patron and the client. Clients are people who benefit from the patron, and in return, they give him their support at election time. They contribute prayers and sacrifices for the patron's household. Perhaps they provide goods and services or work or something for no fee. And the more clients you had, the more prestigious you were. And many patrons were themselves clients of higher ranking patrons. So it was kind of like a pyramid scheme a little bit. So you might have, if your patron was a senator, a high ranking senator with connections in the imperial government, well, you're on your road to success. He can get you the, really cushy jobs. He can get you maybe a really good elected post. He can put you on the pathway to connect to get really wealthy, that sort of thing. Like there's all sorts of things. And so you try and move up that ladder. And patronage has been posited as sort of the foundation for the Catholic system of saints. Basically, there are kind of two components to this. The patronage component, or the potential starting point from patronage, as one of its foundations. So basically, you don't. So God is up here, and you want to get your request into Him, but you're not good enough. You're sinful, and God is really angry all the time, and He needs someone to intervene with Him, somebody who has a little bit more favor, a little bit more grace, a little bit more importance than you do. And so you might seek a patron for that. And perhaps you need to find your keys. So you would go to St. Anthony's, the patron saint, I think, of lost items. Or also, if you wanted to get married, you could go to St. Anthony as well. And in fact, when I was in Brazil the first time, well, the only time so far, but God willing, I'll be there again soon. I saw many statues of St. Anthony he's always kind of holding his hands out like this, and his fingers are snapped off. And I asked my friend Nathan about that, and he said, basically what happens is women come, they pray to St. Anthony for a husband, and they get one, and he's a dud, and so they come and they break his fingers off to kind of get back at St. Anthony. It's kind of funny, but it's interesting. So that's kind of the idea of how the patronage model moves into the church in the form of the patron saints. The other side to that is that saints have more merit because they're holier, they've done more things. And so they will be looked on more favorably by God than you would. So you're going to pray to Mary, and then Mary is going to go to Christ. Because Christ is super holy and he's divine and he's God, he's mad, he's judging, he's ready to smite, but he can't say no to his mom. So I don't know. I think we've talked about that before. We might talk about it a little bit more when it comes to the medieval church, but that's kind of how patronage has influenced a bit in the Roman Catholic Church in particular. Government. Rome starts out as a kingdom, and the Romans overthrow. There's seven kings, and the seventh king is overthrown as a tyrant, and a republic is established. The republic is led by two consuls, and they're elected yearly, and they are supported by the legislative body, which is the Senate. The consuls are responsible for executive authority, so they're like the president, and they are also responsible for leading the Roman army on campaign every summer. If you look at the ancient world and in the medieval world, military campaigns are conducted in summer when the weather is good. In wintertime, you go back home and you wait until summer comes again because in winter, there's no food around. It's all been harvested. But in summertime, their food is abundant and it's easier to campaign and all that kind of thing. So that's the consul's job. Generally, one consul would go out on campaign and the other one would stay in Rome and take care of the government. And years are denoted by the consulship of so and so. So if you read ancient Roman history, what you'll notice is they'll say stuff like in the consulship of Fabius, whatever, or in the consulship of Julius Caesar, or in the second consulship of this guy. That's how they're numbering years, is by consulships. And I don't find it helpful myself. I always need a guide to tell me what the year is, frankly. There are numerous lower offices that people can get elected to, like quaestor and other things. The republic ends in 27 BC. Now, the republic is a republic, but it's not. It's really an oligarchy. It's the people who get elected are from the upper classes. People from the lower classes don't really get elected. One interesting office that existed in the republic was the office of the tribune. And they're called the tribune of the plebs, so the people's tribune. And tribunes were 10 guys, and they were elected, and they had the ability. They had huge amounts of power. They did not lead the armies, but what they did do was stand up for the little guy. They were there to protect the common people, to protect their land from being seized, to protect their rights, and all that sort of thing. And tribunes were given the power of sacrosanctity, which meant that they were untouchable. If you physically touched a tribune, that was a death penalty offense, touching him. So what the tribunes would do, and the tribunes also had the ability to veto legislation that came from the Senate. They had the ability to propose legislation to the Senate. They could even impose laws on their own. They were very, very powerful, and they were a constant thorn in the side of the Senate, but they were part of a series of reforms that were introduced after a rebellion had happened, and they were there to kind of bring the common people back on board with the government. And what tribunes would do, if the Senate was debating something to prevent senators from leaving until the issue was resolved, they would stand in the doorway, and the senators couldn't leave because they couldn't push past them. You push past them, that's touching them, you die. So tribune's very powerful, and the office of tribune lasts throughout the empire, but it really loses a lot of importance. And by the empire, it's not all that important at all anymore. So the republic ends in 27 BC. There's a big civil war between Julius Caesar and a guy named Pompey, and Caesar defeats Pompey and he becomes dictator. And in Rome, the dictatorship was a temporary office that had supreme power that was to exist for 6 months and to allow the dictator to deal with a crisis. So Rome is invaded, there's armies around, there's a famine, whatever. You might appoint a dictator to handle the situation, and then once it was over, his power would be over. But Caesar gets the title of dictator for life, and we've seen a lot of those in the 20th century. And for a lot of people, this is an offense, and a lot of senators find this offensive. And they go and they kill him, as you all know, on the Ides of March. You all know that word, the Ides of March, and Caesar's killed. And you can actually go see in the Roman Forum today, his temple, the ruins are there, and you can see the pyre where his body was burnt. There's an altar there. And it's pretty cool because people leave flowers there even today. So it's quite a thing. It's pretty neat to engage with history about that. So go to Rome, go to the Forum, to walk around Rome. If you're going to Rome, walk around. Don't just take the bus tour. Walk around, embrace it. My feet killed me because I didn't wear in my shoes and I was way out of shape for it. But walk around Rome. Don't cheat yourself. If you can, of course. If you're physically unable, then don't. But in any case, so uh, Julius Caesar dies, he has an he adopts one of his nephews, a guy named Octavian, as his son and heir. This guy is later known as Augustus, and Octavian fights with Mark Antony and Cleopatra, as you all remember. We all know this story. And there's a big battle, and they're fighting and fighting, and then there's a great naval battle, Actium, where Octavian defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and Mark Antony, I believe, I believe he kills himself, as does Cleopatra, and Octavian becomes the big cheese in Rome. And he calls himself the Princeps. Now, Princeps is an interesting word. If you look at it, it looks like the base of prince. This is where we get our word for prince, Princeps. Princeps does not mean prince at this time. It means first among equals. It's the same way that the prime minister is primus inter pares, first among equals. Now, nobody today would look at the prime minister of Canada and say, well, all the ministers in the cabinet are equal. No, there's a very clear hierarchy. Same thing here. Augustus was clearly the big cheese, but he called himself Princeps, first among equals. We're all equal here. I'm just the number one guy. I'm the leader, but you're all important. You're all equal to me, but I'm first. That's all. And this was an attempt to maintain the legal fiction that the republic still existed. For Romans, the republic as a concept was extremely important. Same thing if you look at the United States today, the concept of the American democracy and America being a republic is extremely important. As much as you want to argue that it's more akin to a constitutional monarchy, the idea of republicanism is an important concept. Same thing in Rome. And the Principate, this concept of the emperor as being just merely first among equals, lasts until the reign of the Emperor Domitian. So it lasts almost 100 years from Augustus's time. And it was an attempt to make sure that Romans were on board with the government. They did not like the idea of being ruled by kings. Kings were an anathema to Romans. Romans were never ruled by kings in the Roman Empire after the downfall of the Republic. It's a princeps and then later the emperor, but never kings. Do not call yourself a king. And the emperors later on established emperor worship was seen as a way of honoring the state and showing your loyalty to the state. There's some debate about how much the emperors actually thought of themselves as gods. Some of them certainly did, others didn't. But it was a way of maintaining loyalty and keeping people loyal to you. And so emperor worship developed from there. And the emperor eventually establishes himself as the main power in Rome, and his power comes from the army, not the Senate. The Senate is always a place of problems for the emperor. It's a place of politics and of backbiting and nitpicking and these politicians who don't like each other, and there's all these sorts of rivalries. The emperor gets his power from being the leader of the army. And when the army is on the emperor's side, he's a strong emperor. When the army is not on his side, he's a weak emperor. That's how you can kind of tell who's going to be strong and who's weak. Trajan, great military leader, big army backing. Vespasian, great emperor, great army backing. Augustus, huge army backing, good emperor. Guy like Nero loses the support of the army, loses the support of the Senate, loses Rome. Roman provinces are governed by governors, and these governors are appointed by Rome. Now, the emperor and the Senate split the power of appointment, and the emperor tended to appoint governors in the more important provinces and in the border regions, so people who would be very loyal to him, who owed their career to him, while the Senate would typically appoint them in less important regions. So perhaps in Italy or in interior provinces that weren't all that important, the Senate could appoint governors there. Taxes are collected by independent contractors. This is particularly true in the conquered areas. And these independent contractors are told that they have to remit a certain amount of money to Rome. And what often happens is these collectors then extort people to become rich. Now, you see this in the Bible with tax collectors. They're hated because they do this. They have to submit, let's say you have to submit 1,000,000 sesterces to Rome. You might, throughout your business, charge people a total of 1,200,000 sesterces, and you'd keep 200,000 for yourself and they send 1,000,000 to Rome. And so people would be paying a premium on their taxes, which is what they hated. And these tax collectors were very, very corrupt. in a lot of places. And in some places, it even caused revolts. And Judea, Roman taxation policy was one of the reasons why the Jews revolted, because it was really bad and really corrupt. The Roman religion is important to understand. The Roman pantheon matches the Greek pantheon. They just give it different names, so Latin names for Greek names. So Zeus is Jupiter, Pluto is Hades, Venus is Aphrodite, Athena is Minerva, Ares is Mars, Artemis is Diana. The pantheon is largely the same, and there were many thousands of minor gods, gods and half gods, and all sorts of things. One of Rome's favorite goddesses is, of course, Victory, the goddess Victory, and there is an altar to her in the Senate House itself. And this was the altar to Victory was constantly made use of until the Emperor Theodosius ended that, I believe, or was it Constantine? Anyway, one of the early Christian emperors ended that practice. They had a chief priest called the Pontifex Maximus. Where do you think? Now, that's Chief Priest Pontifex Maximus. Now, who holds this title today? This still exists, by the way, this office. Who holds it? It's the Pope. The Pope in Rome holds the title of Pontifex Maximus, or Supreme Pontiff. That is originally the chief priest of the pagan Roman religion. And the Romans saw their religion as integral to the health of the state. And the reason for this is that Rome saw its religion as being like a conduit for the state, like the spiritual side of the state. And not worshiping gods would be a recipe for disaster. Pliny, the great Roman writer, in a letter laments the influence of Christianity in Asia Minor because pagan temples are falling into ruin. That nobody's taking care of them, nobody's sacrificing at them, nobody's maintaining them because they're all Christians. And he laments this, and he says disaster is going to come upon us because nobody is worshiping the gods. They're going to be angry. Rome generally allowed conquered people to worship whomever they wanted, so long as they also added Roman gods to their worship. And for most pagans, this is not a problem because they already have many gods anyway, so what's a few more? They can just add the Roman gods. And for the Romans, this is a sign of loyalty. You're sacrificing to the Roman gods, you're showing your loyalty to the Roman state and to the empire and to the emperor, and later to the emperor when you're worshiping the emperor. The Jews, however, were given an exemption to this. They are the only people given an exemption to this. The Romans noted in particular how willing the Jews were to turn their land to ashes and to shed so much blood and to shed blood in order to oppose having to worship new gods. And it's interesting because when you read about the accounts of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, they're often called hard-headed and fickle because they run after other gods. They worship other gods. Solomon did this. There are a whole bunch of kings of Israel and Judah who are worshiping other gods, Egyptian gods, Canaanite gods, you name it. And in this era, by this time, the Jews had become very zealous about the one true God. And they were so zealous, they were willing to literally engage in scorched earth to defend the one true God. They were so zealous. They would rather die bloody, horrible deaths and turn their land to ash than have to worship another God. And the Romans kind of respected this because if your God is not worth defending, what kind of God is it? Right? It's a good question. Pagan temples supported, so this Jewish exemption would later benefit the Christians, as we've discussed earlier, because the Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism for about 30 years before Roman persecution started on its own, before they realized that they were not the same. And Christians basically acted under this exemption and were not required to violate their consciences by sacrificing to Roman gods. For the first bit, and so lot of benefits for the Christians in that. Roman temples supported huge pilgrimage and tourism industries. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, for example, if you remember, Paul ran foul of the silversmiths while in Ephesus. They were scared because the religion that Paul was preaching, the faith that he was preaching, would destroy their business. It And remember, they yelled, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That temple provided a lot of work for them, and it was one of the seven wonders of the world, actually. Um, and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and actually the ruins are still there. So if you want to go see it, or the ruins anyway, you can. But Paul ran afoul of those silversmiths. That was a big deal. They made a lot of money selling statues of Artemis to pilgrims who were coming to worship there. So the Roman religion is very important. It's an extension of the state. It is not an independent thing. We tend to view church and state as being separate, but the Romans view them as very much being together. And to disrespect one and to denigrate one is to disrespect the other and to denigrate the other. To not sacrifice to Roman gods was to essentially be advocating for the destruction of the Roman state. So that's why it becomes important later on to understand the interplay of the Roman religion in Christian persecution. The Roman military. The Roman military is basically the weapon of mass destruction in the ancient world. It is divided into legions, and the size of the legions changed over time. But generally, in the imperial period, a legion is composed of about 5,200 men, and this is further broken down into centuries of 100 men. Centuries are led by centurions. Generals commanded legions. Successful and popular generals often held the loyalty of their troops rather than Rome. And this would cause stability issues in the Republic and the Empire. So basically, what this meant was that many troops felt a greater affinity and a greater loyalty to their individual generals than they did to the Roman state. And so when there was instability at the top, if the empire or the emperor was weak, or there was an opening on the throne, or instability, the legions would generally take up with their general. They would support their general, not the Roman state. This is why being a strong general is important. This is why being a strong general means being a strong emperor. If you remember the story of the centurion in the New Testament, the centurion is not just a soldier. He's not a legionary. He is a centurion. He has command of 100 men. This is an officer, a high-ranking officer. He'd be like a kind of a mid-ranking officer in today's military. Very responsible position. So hopefully this gives you a greater concept of, when we're talking about centurions, what that means. And when you read that passage, now you'll have a greater understanding of the responsibility that he had. The Roman military was so successful that for the period between 27 BC and AD 180, it's about 200 years, no one seriously challenged the empire. There was no enemy big enough, strong enough, stupid enough to challenge Roman dominance. There were no invasions, no incursions, and certainly none that Rome could not handle. And this led to a period of unprecedented peace and economic growth called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. And it's in the Roman peace that we see the church developing. And the church benefits from the Roman peace because they don't have to worry about outside influences. They don't have to worry about outside attacks. They don't have to worry about their territory being hived off or having to deal with new rulers. They're dealing with one administration, one government. They have roads, huge road network. They have information sharing networks, all due to the Pax Romana. Peaceful trade. Peaceful trade fosters the fast spread of information. When you have peace, information spreads quickly because you don't have to worry about anything. Rome cleaned up bandits. Like, they were famous for bringing peace and order to the places that they conquered. And that was one of the great things that Rome brought when they conquered places, is that banditry, pirates, illegal activity, instability, gone. Not going to happen. Very swiftly took care of those types of things. And the Roman military, of course, plays a big role in Roman mythology. Roman soldiers have pensions. If you're a soldier, you could potentially become quite wealthy if you were with a successful general. All your plunder, you could send back all that money to your family. gold and silver that you've plundered, even slaves. If you captured people on the battlefield, you could take them as slaves. And if you want to, you could sell them in the slave market or keep them. So being a Roman soldier could make you quite wealthy if you were successful at it. Kind of like how sailors could get rich if they were with successful admirals in the early modern period, but that's different. It's the Royal Navy. Interesting topic on itself, but that's not really church history. So just a look at Roman imperial history here. It starts off with the Julio-Claudians. So this is the first dynasty of Roman emperors, and it begins with the dictatorship of Julius Caesar, the founder of the dynasty. And he rules from 46 to 44 BC, and then he is murdered. This is a great painting, I think, of him. He's meeting a guy named Vercingetorix, the great leader of the Gauls. The Gauls are a barbarian tribe who fought with Rome, who fought with Caesar. Caesar conquered Gaul, which is modern-day France, and this is where he became extremely famous as a general and as a Roman, and his victories were myriad. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because they're barbarians that the Gauls were just some sort of primitive tribe. They were not. They had cities like Steinbach, the size of Steinbach, 15,000 people and bigger. Huge hoards of gold, agricultural systems, road systems. They were more independent. It was more of like a loose confederation of peoples, but very sophisticated nonetheless. And the fact that Caesar conquered them is a great achievement. So this wasn't just conquering some nobody tribe. This was conquering a civilization and a people. Vercingetorix is, when he's captured, he's taken to Rome in a triumph, which is a great big parade that they hold for successful generals. And he is ritually strangled in prison later on in Rome, which kind of happens to a lot of leaders that they capture. And you can see Caesar there, very brash bravado, wearing his toupee because he was in fact bald. But anyway, that's a great painting. The empire itself is founded by Octavian, a guy known as Augustus, and he reigns from 27 BC, which is the end of the Civil War, to 1480. Remember, in your Bible, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that all the world should be taxed. This is the guy, and that means that during Caesar's reign, so that would have been before 14, he issued that decree. He is mentioned in the Bible, and I took this picture at the Vatican Museum in Rome. If you ever have a chance, you have to go. That is a fantastic museum. He is succeeded by his adopted son Tiberius. Tiberius is kind of a mercurial figure. He doesn't really want to be emperor, or at least that's what he kind of intimates to everybody, although he's quite successful at it. But he develops some pretty nasty reputation later on. He gets kind of paranoid. Think about Joseph Stalin and his purges of the 1930s. Treason trials become a big thing under Tiberius later on in his reign, and he retreats to the island of Capri in the Mediterranean, where he has a big villa and palace complex, and that's where he rules from. And Tiberius kind of becomes sort of the ancient writers kind of intimate that he becomes kind of a dirty old man, engaging in various sexual perversities. But nonetheless, he is quite as successful as emperor. And you'll remember that Tiberius is the guy who appoints Pontius Pilate to his role, and it is in fact under Tiberius that Christ is crucified. Tiberius is succeeded by, so basically, okay, Roman emperors tend to die naturally very rarely, and they tend to die by the sword quite a bit. So Augustus is traditionally he's seen as having died naturally, but there's some speculation that he was in fact murdered. Tiberius was definitely murdered by the head of his guard, and then he is succeeded by his grandson. I believe his grandson, whose name is Gaius. We better know him as Caligula. And Caligula means little boots. It is a nickname. Imagine going through history known by your nickname. Those of you who have nicknames. But Caligula means little boots because as a kid, he would go on campaign with his father, who was a guy named Germanicus. And he would wear army fatigues as a little kid, and he wore these little boots. And so he was given the name Caligula. Caligus or Caliga. Caliga is the Roman word for boot, or a military boot, and Caligula is the diminutive of that, so little boots. Caligula initially quite popular, very successful. Later became a bit of a tyrant, and he was bumped off by the Praetorian Guard, and he was succeeded by Claudius, who I believe is his uncle. And Claudius is an old man at the time he becomes emperor. He's older, he's middle aged, and people think he's none too bright. He's not really seen as anybody of any great intellectual ability. People kind of see him as kind of this bumbling, doddering old fool. And in fact, when the Praetorian Guard are searching for him, they find him in the palace hiding behind a curtain because he thinks they're going to kill him. But instead, they pull him out and they declare him emperor. And Claudius is actually turns out to be pretty savvy. He's a good emperor in terms of stability and expanding the empire. And it's under Claudius that Britain is conquered. Caesar tried to conquer Britain, he failed. Claudius does conquer it. And Claudius has the the unfortunate fact that he was married to Nero's mother, or it was Nero's mother. Can't quite remember how that went, but in any case, he's related to Nero's mother, and he has a son named Britannicus, and Claudius intends Britannicus to succeed him, but Britannicus is murdered by Nero's mother. Roman women, you have to watch out for them, particularly at the higher end. Her name is Agrippina the Younger, and, Wikipedia says that she was the most effective woman of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and I have to agree. And yes, so she was married to Claudius, and she's intending for her son Nero, who is not Claudius's son, it's his stepson, to become emperor. And she later orchestrates the poisoning of Claudius himself, and Nero becomes the emperor. And Nero again starts off pretty popular. He's young when he starts; he's 16, and he fancies himself quite the actor. He thinks he's quite the artist, and he even participates in the Olympic Games. And surprise, surprise, he wins every event that he is in. He's that good. It's kind of like Kim Jong-il scoring 32 on a round of golf. How can you compete with somebody like that? I wonder how he was that good. Anyway, Nero is a great poet, and he considers himself a great actor, and he acts and he does poetry, which is kind of not. It doesn't bode well in terms of the Roman people, because they actually consider actors to be actors were kind of on the level of prostitutes at that time. And so for the emperor to be an actor is like the emperor being a prostitute. It doesn't go over very well. Nero, of course, was the emperor. We discussed this in the persecution sessions, who was around during the Great Fire of Rome. And instead of rebuilding the city, or despite attempting to look like he was rebuilding the city, he built a great palace for himself called the Domus Aurea over 1/3 of the burnt city of Rome. And he was quite unpopular by the end, and the Senate anathematized him and declared him an outlaw, and he eventually killed himself by suicide. The Julio-Claudians lost the throne. There was a period of time called the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Vitellius, Otto, and Vespasian. So the Julio-Claudians lose the throne after Nero, and they're replaced by the Flavian dynasty. The Flavians are Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Vespasian is the emperor who is on campaign to conquer or to suppress the Jewish revolt. And he is recalled to Rome when the army declares him emperor. And his son Titus is the conqueror of Rome. He reigns for 2 years after his father dies, and Domitian, his brother, reigns after him. Domitian is kind of seen as a tyrant himself, and he is seen as the guy who is more confident being called Lord rather than princeps. Domitian is murdered, and the Senate appoints an aged senator called Nerva to be emperor. Nerva is very old, and he only lasts about 2 years. And then we come into a period of time known as the era of the 5 good emperors. And this is mainly because they were very competent. And they were not really all that corrupt as compared to their successors or their predecessors. So you start with Nerva, who's old, but he's a stabilizer. He stabilizes things. Nerva adopts as his son a successful general, a guy named Trajan, who is the greatest of the pagan Roman emperors, and he is also one of the greatest generals in Roman society. Trajan is not Roman. He is Spanish. He is from Spain. And then he adopts as his successor a guy named Hadrian. Hadrian has a big villa that he established near Tivoli, which is just outside of Rome. It's called Hadrian's Villa. You can go see it today. The ruins are there. He was famous for stabilizing the empire, keeping it sort of at its largest extent, and he deified his lover, and he built a wall. Remember Hadrian's Wall in the north of England to keep out those bothersome Scots. And so he built that wall there, and the wall's still there. Great administrator, ruthless politician, but a very good administrator. Then he's succeeded by his adopted son, a guy named Antoninus, who's later given the name Pius because he has a good reputation for being very religious. And Antoninus is an all-around good administrator, and there's not any war recorded under Antoninus. He maintained the empire, but he didn't go to war. It was pretty stable. And then he adopts as his son a guy named Marcus Aurelius. If you remember the movie Gladiator, he's the first emperor in the movie Gladiator, or he's the old emperor in the movie Gladiator. And Marcus Aurelius has a son named Commodus, and this is the problem, is that he passes on the empire to his blood son, and he doesn't pick a really good successor. All these other guys had picked successors based on their competence. And Marcus Aurelius picks Commodus because he's his kid. And it just goes downhill from there. So this is the era of the five good emperors, about 100 years of peace and stability in the empire. And the Pax Romana ends with Marcus Aurelius. So just to put the emperors and the New Testament together, so Jesus is born during the reign of Augustus. He's crucified during the reign of Tiberius. Peter and Paul are executed and arrested and executed during the reign of Nero, and John is imprisoned during the reign of Domitian. And he probably dies under Trajan. So there you go. That's sort of the history of the church with the emperors, if you just to put that into context. As the second century goes on, things kind of degrade, and the empire loses strength and power, and you end up with this crisis of the third century, which basically is a crisis of politics. The leadership at the top is not strong. Emperors don't last very long. Their administrations are not good. Armies are constantly in revolt, supporting their generals over the state. And it's generally a period of civil war and instability in the Roman Empire. And this is really not good. And you can see here on this map all the things that happen to a bunch of emperors in a bunch of different parts of the empire. And it's not really good. You have assassinations, you have murders, you have emperors being captured in battle. Valerian is captured in battle, which was extremely embarrassing for Rome to have one of their emperors captured. A whole bunch of emperors which you've never heard of and which are not important for our purposes are killed or die in battle or in civil war. And things kind of generally deteriorate during the third century. So at the end of this crisis, a guy named Diocletian becomes emperor. And Diocletian is a successful general, and he's one of these strong men. He's one of these singular people who can bring order to chaotic situations. And he looks at the empire and he says, look, the reason why this whole thing is falling apart is this is far too big for one guy to rule effectively. Like, how can one person rule this whole thing? It's too big, it's too diverse. There's too many borders, there's too many invaders. We need a better form of government. And so he decides to split the empire in half. And so he splits it into the east and into the west. And Maximian is given the job of ruling the west. Diocletian takes the job of ruling the east. And he further decides that to make things even easier, he's going to split the east and the west up into halves. So you'll have senior emperors, one in the west and one in the east, and you'll have junior emperors, one in the west, one in the east. So you have 4 emperors. And these emperors each rule their own little section of the empire. Now, it's important to remember that the empire is at this time still seen as a single unit, one empire with four emperors. It's not four kingdoms, although often that's how it's governed. It's four administrators. It'd be like four chief administrators. And the junior emperor in the west is a guy named Constantius Chlorus, who is the father of Constantine, and Galerius in the east. And this is what it looked like. So you see there the divisions of the east and the west. So you have Constantius Chlorus. He has the yellow part there, Britain and Gaul. Maximian rules Italy with the capital Rome, and northern Africa and Spain. And Diocletian has the Balkans, Greece, and Dalmatia there. And, Galerius has those. And then Diocletian has the East, with the Egypt, the Middle East, and Asia Minor. And this is kind of how it goes. Now, Diocletian is clearly the senior partner in all of this. And he's the guy who has the most power. And he's the guy who keeps the peace between the empire, between the emperors. That's kind of his job. And but eventually he decides that he needs to retire. He does not want to die in office. He wants to retire, and he's got a great palace at Nicomedia where he wants to retire. And the way it works is that when the senior emperor retires, the junior emperor moves up. Now, in Diocletian, when Diocletian decides to retire, Maximian doesn't really want to retire. He likes being emperor. But Diocletian forces him to retire, and the junior emperors, Galerius and Constantius, are promoted. And then there's a whole big kerfuffle. Different fighting going on. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts. If you want to read up on this, just read up on it. But there's complicated moves back and forth, intermarriages and whatnot. And Constantius Chlorus ends up as the senior emperor in the West, and he appoints his son Constantine as the junior emperor. And there's a big battle that goes on, and it eventually ends up with Constantine the Great becoming emperor in the West in 312. So he becomes the emperor in the West when his father dies. And he sees a vision which tells him, and he's in a battle with with Maxentius, who is the other emperor in the East now. And he has a battle, and he's fighting for control of the empire with him. Again, if you're interested in the history of the interweaving politics of all that, go look it up. It's very complicated. So anyway, there's this big battle that's going to come along. And Constantine is marching to Rome to meet Maxentius and to fight him in 312. And Constantine sees a vision in heaven, and he sees a heavenly vision that tells him to paint the Chi Rho, which is a Christian symbol. It's like an X and a P together, and this is the symbol. This symbolizes Christ. It's an early Christian symbol. It's like the cross. The XP is the first two words of Christ in the Greek language. So you put the Chi Rho on your shield, and you will have victory. And so he does this, and sure enough, he wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The bridge is there still. You can go see it. It's not the original one, I believe, though. And in 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity. The great Christian God has given him this great victory. And he fights a war with the co-emperor in the east, a guy named Licinius. He defeats him entirely in 324, and he's now the sole emperor. He's the head honcho, big cheese. He's the number one guy. There are no junior emperors now. He is the only emperor. And it's worth noting that Constantine's mother was a Christian, and she probably influenced him quite a bit. Her name was Helena, and she's responsible for a lot of churches being built throughout the empire. So in recognition of how much the East had grown in political and economic importance, he decides to move the imperial capital from Rome to the ancient Greek settlement of Byzantium, which is on the Bosporus Straits. And this is a city that he renames Constantinople. If you're the emperor, you, of course, can rename cities after yourself, and he does this. And Constantinople, interestingly enough, is today modern-day Istanbul. It's a fantastic city. I recommend you go see it sometime in your life. It is, I have described it as intoxicating. And if you go there, you will see why. The mixture of East and West is just incredible. And it's actually known as Constantinople up until the modern era, up until the 1930s, when it is renamed Istanbul. And Rome at this time, its decline is obvious, but it begins a very slow and steady decline, particularly in the West. So this is Constantinople. I just wanted to put a map in here to show you how strategic the city is. It's on a peninsula, which means it only has to worry about landward defenses on one side. And it has a seawall that's around it. If you notice, there's a chain over here crossing the Golden Horn. This was to prevent ships from going up the Golden Horn and attacking by land here, landing soldiers and attacking by land. So they had a great big chain, and the chain is still there. You can go see the remains of the chain. It is quite impressive. The Great Wall of Theodosius is over here. This was a triple wall with a moat. It was impenetrable, and Constantinople was not conquered. It was only conquered once by the Latin Christian Crusaders from the time that Constantine established it. So a very strategic city, very important, very beautiful, and the center of Christianity for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Hagia Sophia, definitely worth seeing, one of the great churches of the church, one of the great cathedrals of the church. Constantine is widely acknowledged as the first emperor. However, his date of conversion is uncertain. We know that his mother, Helena, was a Christian. And as emperor, he's responsible for several important things. But one of the most important is the Council of Nicaea, which he calls in 325 to settle the theological dispute between Arians and Orthodox Christians. We've discussed this a little bit before when we talked about heresy in the early church. And he calls this council to decide that issue. He enforces the council's decision as a matter of government policy. And it's at this time that the church and state begin sort of a tentative but permanent entanglement that has lasted today. With Constantine, the church becomes an integral part of the state, and the state becomes one of the integral enforcers of church teaching. So Constantine, as I said, he enforces the Council of Nicaea's declarations as state policy. So if you don't agree with them, he'll exile you or worse. It is said it's recorded historically or traditionally that Constantine is baptized on his deathbed in 337 by Eusebius, an Arian bishop. Why so late? If he's a Christian, why do you get baptized so late? Well, the real reason you get baptized so late is because in the early church, there was a common belief that you could not go to heaven if you committed certain bad sins after you were baptized. And this was common. This happened to Augustine. Constantine, being an emperor, he's got to do some pretty nasty things sometimes. He's got to, take out his enemies and commit murders and all that kind of thing. So if he's baptized and then he does those things, he's going to be sent to hell. But if he waits till he's baptized on his deathbed, those sins get forgiven as well. So that's why that happens. I don't think it's a question of him only converting on his deathbed. It's that he was baptized on his deathbed. But the issue of Constantine is also greater in that when he declares Christianity legal and he becomes sort of a proselyte Christian, a new Christian, as the emperor, everybody starts coming to him with all their theological questions. They want him to settle these disputes. And he's smart enough to realize that he can't do it. I mean, imagine a new Christian, any new Christian that you know, or any new Christian you've known in your life. And you come to them and you say, settle the issue of the divinity and the humanity of Jesus. What are the natures of Christ? What date should Easter be? Who is the Holy Spirit? Tell us the significance of baptism and communion. That's a difficult question for lots of mature Christians to answer, not to mention a new one. And so quite rightly, he calls a council to deal with those issues. The fall of the West. So the empire goes, after Constantine goes on as a split affair, he splits it among his sons before he dies. He puts one emperor in the east and one emperor in the west. No more of this four emperor nonsense. And there are very few emperors who rule the whole thing after him. I believe Theodosius II is the last to rule a unified Roman Empire, and it doesn't last very long. The West is generally weaker, the weaker of the halves. It's the poorer of the halves. It's the more porous of the halves. It's under more pressure from the Germanic tribes. The borders on the Rhine and Danube River have many Germanic tribes, and they, having converted to Christianity, they've converted to Christianity. They're crossing and settling into the empire because they're seeking peace and stability, and their populations are growing so much they need room to move, and so they settle in the empire, which causes a lot of problems because the Western Empire doesn't like this. It's destabilizing to them. And the Western Empire denies these Germanic tribes land and refuses to recognize their right to settle. And for about a century, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals invade the Western Empire and do a lot of damage. They put Rome under siege and other great cities under siege, and they destroy a lot of wealth. In 476, Rome itself is attacked and falls to a guy named Odoacer, who then styles himself King of Italy and declares nominal allegiance to the Eastern Roman Emperor, and the Western Empire is effectively ended at that point. Rome is kind of moving on as a backwater. The capital of the Western Empire had moved to Ravenna sometime before then, because Ravenna is more easily defensible. It's in a series of swamps, and it's more difficult to attack. So Rome by this time is kind of a downtrodden city. The great power in Rome is, of course, the Pope. The Bishop of Rome by this time has developed a great deal of authority, and it is he who is negotiating with Odoacer during the sack of Rome, not the imperial authorities. And the church continues to fill these power vacuums in Western Europe. It is the only organization that has cohesive policy, cohesive structures, cohesive leadership in the Western Empire after the fall of the Roman Empire. Politically, the whole thing splits into different duchies and principalities and kingdoms and warlordships. But the Pope and the Church are the only ongoing power left over from the Roman era that have a solid structure, a solid structure, solid leadership, solid value, laws, structure, all that sort of thing. The Eastern Empire, as I've mentioned before, continues on for about another 1,000 years after this, so that's quite something. And it comes to an end in 1453, much reduced. So the Eastern Empire reaches its largest extent under a guy named Justinian. You may have heard of Justinian. He's the guy who built the Hagia Sophia. The Eastern Empire is Greek-speaking. However, Eastern Romans, while called Greeks by others, never see themselves as Greek. They call themselves Romans. They maintain that they are Romans. They are the successors of Rome. They are Romans, and they maintain that until the end. And they consider their emperor to be the sole Roman emperor. They don't call themselves Byzantines. They don't call themselves the Byzantine Empire or the emperor. They are Romans. And this debate over the sole Roman emperorship would cause issues with the West later on as the Holy Roman Empire grows, and there's a whole bunch of debate over who's the true emperor and who's the better emperor and all that kind of stuff. Just to give you an idea, this is what the Roman Empire looks like under Justinian at its height. He basically reconquered huge parts of Italy, well, all of Italy really, North Africa and Spain. He reconquers this. This is the biggest that the Roman Empire will get, or the Eastern Empire will get, and it'll shrink down very quickly after this. And in particular, it starts shrinking down even more quickly with the Islamic invasions later on in the 7th and 8th centuries. The last part of it to fall is the great city of Constantinople, and it only falls because somebody gave the Ottoman Turks a cannon, a prototype cannon. The Islamic invasions of the East targeted North Africa and the Middle East. Jerusalem falls in 637. It only returns to Christian rule during the Crusades for a very short period of time, and then returns to Islamic overlordship until the modern day. The Eastern Emperor Alexius Comnenus asked Pope Urban II for help in repelling Muslims who were threatening his land in Asia Minor in 1099, and this initiates the period known as the Crusades. The First Crusade comes from this request from the Eastern Roman Emperor. The biggest blow to the empire, and I think also to Europe in the medieval times, comes between 1202 and 1204, when the Fourth Crusade attacks Constantinople and overthrows the emperor, installing a Catholic Latin emperor. The empire is so weakened by this treachery, which was caused by the Venetians, that it's unable to act as a dam against the spread of Islam. So Constantinople acted like a cork that held Islam at bay in Asia Minor. But after it's weakened in 1200, that leads to its fall in 1453 because it never ever recovers in those 200 years. It was a very, very bad thing. And Constantinople falls in a siege to a guy named Mehmed II. He's known as Mehmed the Conqueror, who initiates the Ottoman Empire, which basically threatens Christian Europe with annihilation for 200 years. This was a very strong empire. It got to the gates of Vienna in the 1600s. It was very, very powerful. So what happened with the Fourth Crusade, just to kind of deal with this now, and we'll talk about the Crusades later on, but the Fourth Crusade basically was indebted to the Venetians, and the Venetians supplied ships and money for it. And they said, in return for us supplying this, we just want you to take a little detour to Constantinople. So they did, and the Venetians used the Crusader army, which was intended to help stabilize Christian kingdoms in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and they used the army to sack Constantinople. And that was absolutely terrible. And they actually stole the Quadriga, it's a very famous statue, from Constantinople and installed it on St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where you can go see it today. It's still there. The original is inside the basilica. It's pretty cool. So there you go. That's a very quick history of the Roman Empire. And it's important to us because we need to understand that this is the context in which the church was formed and in which the early church grew. So I hope you found this useful. You can always email me questions about this later on. And I will do another video yet on Roman Judea, which was the successor to this session. And then after having watched those, you'll be all caught up to where we were. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy these sort of bonus sessions, and we'll see you later.